Okay, once again, Assalamu alaikum. This is the second lecture for today. It's going to be about learning. So learning, it's going to be divided in two lectures. So today, it's going to be the first part. Next week is going to be the second parts. Okay, this is the reading materials for this lecture, if you are interested. So the main objectives of today's lecture, we're gonna define learning, we're gonna identify the processes of learning and explain the classical conditioning, which is types of learning. Okay, some basic principles. What is learning? Learning, we all know, is something all humans do, right? Learning, نتعلم. It's basically تعلم, okay? All humans. As you can see in this slide, not only we were born, يعني الفيتس is learning. إيش معنى fetus؟ هو لسه أنت في بطن أمك. You're learning how to breathe, how to move, it's learning. Infants, children, adult learn. Okay? يعني معناها أن learning is a lifelong process. It starts from fetus, when you are inside your mom's womb, till you become an adult. Okay? Right. What is learning? What's the definition of learning? It's basically learning means you are acquiring knowledge or a skill. How are you going to acquire this knowledge? How are you going to get this knowledge and skills? Either by study, right? When you read things, or you read an instruction. When I instruct, يعني زي الآن. How are you going to learn? Is by listening to my lecture. This is one of the way to learn, right? Teaching. When you start to teach. فحنا دائما نقول أصلا the best way of learning when you مثلا you read things تبغاها تكون محفورة عندك وتتعلم بشكل أفضل, you start to teach it. Okay? And also you practice it. يعني مثلا you want to learn how to drive. First, you will acquire knowledge about driving, a general knowledge. You study it. Okay? You practice it. Then you can even teach. Okay? So, learning is an acquisition of acquiring knowledge or skill. Okay? The process by which behavior is changed, shaped, or controlled. يعني how we make sure that the learning start to happen is by observing your behavior. So السلوك حقك يتغير. صح ولا لا؟ فالlearning, when you learn something, يعني الآن خلينا نقول أنت you start to learn مثلا kid, he start to learn how to walk. How? We're gonna talk later, but he start to learn how to walk by observing. مثلا يشوف كيف الناس اللي حوله, genetics, ممكن يعني الجينز, عن طريق الوراثة, عن طريق المايندز. اوكي, كيف انه يمشي, يعني مخزن عنده في البرين, قاعد يشوف ناس كيف تمشي, بعدين ايش بدأ يمشي. هذا ايش change في البيهيفير. ف changing في البيهيفير عادة the result of experience or practice. Okay, so it's a process of constructing understanding based on experience from a wide range of sources. Process of constructing. شو معنى constructing؟ constructing يعني بناء. Process of constructing understanding based on experience from a wide range of sources. Okay, يعني أنت الآن تبني, معناه learning إيش؟ إنك تبني إيش understanding. بناء عن إيش؟ ايش اللي فهمت عن طريق ايش؟ عن طريق خبرات سابقة. ومنين اكتسبت الخبرات هذه؟ من مصادر معلومات مختلفة. فهذا definition of learning. فلما واحد يسألك what's learning is basically you acquired knowledge. That knowledge that you acquired is start to affect your behavior. It's going to change your behavior. Okay? This is basically learning. Okay. How do we learn? How do we learn? Either direct instruction. I tell you what to do. Do this, 1, 2, 3. This is how you learn. Or by trial and error. What does that mean? تجرب الشيء وتخطي بعدين تتعلم منه. Okay? هذا trial and error. You try وتعرف ان هذا غلط، خلاص فتتعلم منه. هذا يسمونه try and error. Other way to learn is by observation. يعني مثلا you are a kid. You're always watching your father going to the mosque. You observing him. يعني تشوفه انت قاعد دائما يصلي. فايش انت قاعد تتعلم انك تصلي تروح في المسجد. هذا ايش؟ you learn by observation. الاطفال لما يشوفون مثلا ان اخوانهم الكبار دائما يتهاوشون، فهو خلاص يتعلم منك. He observed this. Okay? طيب. Other way to learn is by association. You associate two events with each other and you learn from it. وهذا اللي احنا نتكلم فيه، اللي احنا نسميه classical conditioning. هذا اللي يسمونه associate learning. So where two events presented closely to each other will be connected to each other. هذا اللي حنفصل منه. معظم المحاضرة حنتكلم عن هذا الشيء اللي هو association learning. You learn by associate. يعني انك تتعلم عن طريق الربط بين الاشياء. تربط بين شيء وشيء. اوكي؟ طيب. ABC of learning. ABC of learning. What does that mean? شوف هنا في السلايد هذا. Something we called antecedents, behavior, consequences. الbehavior السلوك حقك اللي انت عملته. قبل السلوك هذا في antecedent، في stimuli، في محفز للسلوك. بعد السلوك في توابع للسلوك يسمونه consequences. antecedents means a stimuli, events that precede a behavior. الأشياء اللي تجي قبل السلوك. الbehavior is السلوك itself, the response, the action of the individuals. For example هنا eating and walking. هذا إيش؟ When you eat, this is a behavior. Okay, walking, this is a behavior. Consequences, the events that contingently follows a behavior. يعني إيش اللي صار بعد الbehavior. هذا مهم ليش؟ عشان نتعلم when we talk about the classical conditioning. اللي هو إيش؟ اللي هو عنوان المحاضرة هذه أو زبدة المحاضرة هذه اللي هو classical conditioning. Okay. again antecedents, behavior, consequences. Okay شباب؟ يعني طيب. Next slide. This is again ABC of learning. A stand for antecedents, B for behavior, C consequences. Antecedents is the stimuli, المحفز. الbehavior السلوك itself. The consequences what happened after الbehavior. Okay? طيب. How does learning happen other than through language and words? يعني هنا كيف احنا قاعد نتعلم غير ما نقرا الشيء عن طريق اللانجوج والwords. انت صح. اول way of learning is by readings. مثلا قاعد تتعلم عن طريق انك تقرا، وهذه عن طريق الدراسة. هذا واضح. طيب. Other way of learning اللي هو عن طريق الassociation. We learn by association. Okay? We learn from our experience. When we learn to anticipate events we already like or don't like by noticing other events or sensations that happen first. What does that mean? يعني مثلا كيف تتعلم من your experience؟ أنا بعطيك مثال. خلينا نقول you failed, you didn't study for the exam and you failed. إيش تعلمت هنا؟ أن عدم الدراسة تؤدي إلى الرسوب. فأنت شو تسوي؟ you learn from the experience. إيش الإكسبيرينس؟ إيش اللي استفدت من الإكسبيرينس هذه؟ إن إيش؟ لا I need to study. لأنك إيش أنت عرفت إيش الشيء اللي صار. فالسلوك حقك إيش كان عبارة عن إيش؟ عدم الدراسة. هذا البيهيفير حقك you didn't study. إيش الكونسيكونسز صار؟ you failed the exam. based عليها إني أنا I failed the exam I change I learn from my experience. أوكي شباب؟ فأنت قاعد تتعلم من الإكسبيرينس حقتك. أوكي طيب when we watch what other people do برضو هذا قاعد تتعلم، برضو جزء من الإكسبيرينس. أنت قاعد تتعلم من إيش؟ خلينا نقول مثلا أعطيك an example when you drive أو to learn the driving. إذا كنت تتذكر the first day of driving أول شيء تعلمته كيف؟ by observing your father or your big brother how to drive. كيف يعشق، كيف يدوس البنزين، صح ولا لا؟ this you watch. okay طيب هذا one way. the other way of learning is association. when two stimuli event or sensation tend to occur together or in sequence. هذا اللي احنا حنتكلم عنه. what does that mean؟ كيف تتعلم عن طريق ربط حدثين مع بعض. كيف تتعلم؟ okay we'll talk about this. okay طيب when actions become associated with pleasant or aversive results. when actions become associated with pleasant or aversive results. يعني مثلا أنت عملت أكشن. إيش الأكشن؟ حدث أو سلوك معين. مثلا خلينا نقول let's say you start eating chocolates. by eating chocolates you felt happy. فتعلمت إيش؟ إنه والله you associate eating chocolate with happiness. okay طيب مثلا خلينا نقول this is pleasant. you associate an action with pleasant results. لا خلينا نقول aversive result. aversive result معناها شيء سيء. مثلا خلينا نقول you start smoking. you start smoking ناتج عن smoking you smell very bad. ولاحظت ان الناس يتهربون منك ما يقعدون معك. ايش تعلمت انا؟ associate what؟ smoking خلتك ايش؟ عندك bad smell associated that people running away from you. you learn you associate in smoking people will run away. okay طيب when two pieces of information are linked. معلومتين مع بعض linked to each other. okay back to this slide. yeah okay stimulus 1 see the lightning. in this example هنا شباب you see the lightning. طبعا اللايتنينج انت تشوفه الان is associated with thunder الرعد الصوت. فانت لما تشوف lightning you're not gonna ايش close your or ولا cover your ears. لكن with time you start to learn أن lightning associated with thunder. whenever you see the lightning you will cover your ears. okay so فالlightning في البداية the lightning with thunder. here our response to thunder becomes associated with lightning. يعني thunder is a stimulus. okay thunder stimulus. انت لما تشوف تسمع الصوت هذا you will cover your ears. فهذا هذا stimulus. What's your response covering your ears? Lightening, this is another stimulus. When you see the lightening at the beginning, you're not gonna cover your ears. لكن with time, لما دائما you associate شوفة اللايتنينج البرق مع الرعد، أول ما تشوفه خلاص على طول حتقفل إذنك، صح؟ You learn. هذا اللي زي مثال الدوغ مع الجرس. أوكي؟ هذا احنا نسميه classical conditionings. طيب. Other way of associate learning, you learn by association, is حاجة احنا نسميها operant conditioning. فتتذكرون أول شيء لما تكلمنا عن antecedent والbehavioral consequences. In this example, what is operant conditionings? Operant conditionings. مثلا, child in supermarket cries, wants a chocolate. A fathers would say no, no chocolate. The child's, what will happen with the child? He starts to crying more. Father insists to say no. Child will start to cry more louder and louder. Fathers give him the chocolate because he's tired of his crying. What happened here? The child start to learn that is what? Is by crying I will get what I want. خلاص يتعلم الآن. لأن إيش أنت سويت الآن؟ هو تعلم إنه لما أصيح وأبوي يعطيني اللي يبي. Okay? When become louder, he's more likely to get what he wants. صح؟ هذا إحنا نسميه operant conditioning. Okay? هذا one example. An example written in the slide here. Child associate his response behavior with consequences. For example, child start to learn to repeat behavior by saying إيش please, which were followed by desired results. يعني مثلا كل ما ابنك مثلا يسوي يعني يقول والله لو سمحت أبغى الشوكولات، تعطيه الشوكولات. إيش تعلم هو؟ تعلم أنه by saying please he will get a pleasant things. He will get a cookie. كل ما يقول please تعطيه cookie. خلاص he will learn. Okay? طيب. Child learn to avoid behavior, yelling, which were followed by undesirable result. يعني مثلا هنا child to learn to avoid behavior. مثلا child يتعلم لما يصارخ مثلا أو يبدأ مثلا يقول ألفاظ سيئة تحرم أنت من الديزرت، من الحلا. فهو يتعلم إيش؟ كل ما يصارخ كل ما يقل أدبه مثلا ما تعطيه حلا. فهي يتعلم أنا من أصارخ معناها النتيجة إيش؟ إني ما أخذ حلا. فيبدأ إيش؟ السلوك هذا إيش؟ يتغير ويوقف. ما راح إيش؟ ما راح تعزز السلوك، بالعكس تقلل من السلوك. أوكي؟ هذه another way of learning اللي احنا نسميه associated learning اللي operant conditioning. ف as you remember from the beginning slide, في you learn by experience and you learn by associations. Okay? طيب. Here types of learning. We talked about in brief about classical conditioning. We're gonna talk more details for the rest of this presentation. And operant conditioning, just briefly again. We'll talk more in the next lecture about operant conditioning. وmodeling or observation learning من الاسم يعني you learn by observation by modeling انك ايش تقلد الناس الثانيين. هذا you learn by it. اوكي طيب نيجي للclassical conditionings. اوكي شباب طيب classical conditionings is what is classical conditioning is a type of learning by associations. Okay, if you remember the example of the dog with the foot, is a type of learning in which we learn to link two or more stimuli and anticipate an event. تربط شيئين مع بعض and you anticipate what happened. Okay? اوكي شباب؟ طيب just remember the example of the dog. Okay, in this slide يعني when you read in this the second sentence of this slide, previously neutral stimulus becomes associated with another stimulus through repeated pairing with that stimulus. What does that mean? Means as the example of the dog. الستيمولس أول ستيمولس احنا نسميه ايش قلنا؟ الكلاسيكال اللي هو the first stimulus اللي هو the food. When the dog sees the food is a stimulus. Seizing the food is stimulus. ايش response? What's the response? Is to start to salivate. Okay? You pair the stimulus, the food, with another stimulus اللي هو ايش؟ ringing the bell. By ringing the bell. Ringing the bell first, لما a dog hear the ringing the bell is not going to induce a response. هذا احنا نسميه neutral stimulus. Neutral stimulus, when you associate neutral يعني you pair it مع الفود with time, a neutral stimulus will induce a response. فحيتحول من neutral stimulus إلى conditioned stimulus. And we'll talk about this in more detail in the next slide. Okay, so here in this slide, we'll go through a key terminology in classical conditioning. First, we need to know two things. There is a stimulus and there is a response. Stimulus and the response. Okay? You start with the stimulus. There is unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus. Okay? And there is conditioned response, unconditioned response. Okay? And there is a neutral stimulus. Okay? It's very complicated slide. Just focus. Let's start with the first one. Unconditioned stimulus. What does that mean? It's any stimulus that will always, the key word هنا شباب, always and naturally by nature will elicit a response. زي مثال ايش؟ حط هنا في بالك مثال a dog with food. When the dog sees the food, the food here is what? Unconditioned stimulus will elicit a response by nature. هو ما يتعلم صح؟ He's born with it. هذا احنا نسميه unconditioned stimulus. A stimulus that unconditionally, naturally and automatically triggers a response. ما يتعلم بشكل automatically. Okay? طيب. Unconditioned response اللي هو ايش؟ The dog start to salivate. Okay? معناها ايش؟ Any response that always again and naturally occurs at the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. فمعناها ايش هنا؟ The food here is unconditioned stimulus. Salivation of the dog is unconditioned response. دائما مع بعض يا شباب. unconditioned stimulus يجي معاها unconditioned response. لا تلخبط، ما في conditioned stimulus مع unconditioned، لا. ما دام unconditioned stimulus فالريسبونس حيكون لازم يكون unconditioned. اوكي شباب؟ طيب. ايش neutral stimulus؟ It is a stimulus that does not naturally elicit a response associated with unconditioned response. Remember the example of the dog. هنا النيوترال stimulus هنا ايش؟ الجرس. الجرس by itself it will not produce or induce a response. اللي هو ايش unconditioned response هنا في الدوغ اللي هو salivation. Does hearing the bell will induce salivation؟ لا. فحنا شو نسميه هنا الستيمولس هذا؟ نسميه neutral stimulus. اوكي؟ طيب. Next. Conditioned stimulus. هنا just focus. I will read the slide, then I will explain. Any stimulus that will, after association with an unconditioned stimulus, cause a conditioned response when presented to a subject by itself. So, in classical conditioning, any originally neutral stimulus that, after association with unconditioned stimulus, comes to trigger a conditioned response. I will give you the same example حق الدوغ. ركز. Focus. The dog, when he sees the food is unconditioned stimulus. بشكل طبيعي will always induce unconditioned response, which is salivation. Okay? You start ايش؟ you associate. انت تبغى ايش؟ تبغى الكلب الدوغ يتعلم ان لما يسمع الجرس he will salivate. يبدأ يسعبن. أولا شو بتسوي؟ You bring the bell. You ring it. When you ring the bell at the beginning, we call this stimulus neutral stimulus. ليه neutral? Because it will not induce any response. Okay? طيب. When you pair it with time, دائما when you bring the food تضرب الجرس. Bring the food تضرب الجرس. Bring the food تضرب الجرس. With time, the dog will learn what? Whenever he hear the ring, the bell, in his mind the food is coming. He starts to salivate. The ringing the bell here صار ايش؟ conditioned stimulus. والsalivation من الدوغ صار ايش؟ conditioned response. Okay? As you can see, any response that occurs upon the presentation of conditioned stimulus. خلاص يا شباب؟ فلما conditioned unconditioned stimulus معاها unconditioned response. Conditioned stimulus معاها ايش؟ conditioned response. اوكي يا شباب؟ طيب. Ivan Pavlov discovery اللي هو example of the dog. Okay? I will read the slides. This is the example that I gave you earlier. Mainly the author or the experimenter or scientist is called Pavlov. When you hear Ivan Pavlov على طول يجي في بالك the dog experience, the experiments and classical conditioning. Okay? I will read the slides for you. I just explained to you earlier, but I will read it for you. While studying salivation in dogs, Ivan Pavlov found that salivation from eating food was eventually triggered by what should have been neutral stimulus, such as seeing the dish. Neutral stimulus, such as seeing the dish. But seeing the dish here is seeing the dish is unconditioned stimulus. Okay? But seeing the person who brought the food, just hearing the person's footsteps, ما علينا. هنا before conditionings, just repeating the example. A neutral stimulus, a stimulus which does not trigger a response. Ringing the bell. Okay? Right. Next slide. You ring the bell. What will happen to the dog? No response. Okay? What we call this? A neutral stimulus. Okay. Unconditioned stimulus, I'm just repeating, using the same example. Unconditioned stimulus and response, a stimulus which trigger a response naturally before and without any conditioning. Okay. Unconditioned stimulus. Yummy dog food. Unconditioned response, dog salivates. Okay? Whenever he sees the food, he will salivate. So, seeing the food is unconditioned stimulus. Salivate here is unconditioned response. Okay. During conditioning, what will happen? You're ringing the bell with unconditioned stimulus اللي هو food. ايش unconditioned response is? Dog salivates. Okay? What will happen with time? Whenever the dog sees the food, you ring the bell. With time, what will happen after conditioning? The dog begins to salivate upon hearing the tone of the bell. So the bell now, initially it was a neutral stimulus. With time it become conditioned stimulus, and the response اللي هو salivation هنا صار conditioned response. Okay شباب, the same here. Okay, هذا المثال. طيب, next, just the same what I said, يعني just repeating يعني. طيب, هنا give you this is an examples, different example of classical conditioning. Okay, the first example, let's focus about the second example. The nurse says, "This won't hurt a bit," just before stabbing you with a needle. The next time you hear "this won't hurt," you cringe in fear. Here, "this won't hurt a bit." Hearing this at the beginning, انت لما تسمع النيرس saying "this won't hurt a bit," هذا ما راح يألمك. Are you gonna cringe with fear? No, you're not gonna cringe. فهنا هذا neutral stimulus. Cringing with fear is a response هنا. Okay? طيب, the nurse, what happened with the nurse? You learn by association أن when she said "this won't hurt a bit," she injects you with a needle, you start to feel pain. Okay? And start to cringe in fear. خلاص تبدأ تخاف. فصار هنا بعدين. With time, next time, when you hear a nurse saying خلاص الآن أنت لا راح تضربك إبرة ولا هم يحزنون, أنت قاعد في أمان الله, and nurse start to say "this won't hurt a bit." فجأة أنت خفت. هنا إيش صار؟ "this won't hurt a bit" become conditioned stimulus. you cringe in fear, تبدأ تخاف, صار إيش؟ conditioned response. Okay شباب? This is just an examples about classical conditioning. Okay? Okay. Pavlov experiments هنا, just press in the YouTube, will give you like a video about the dog experiments. Okay, again, here, another example of classical conditionings. يعني I don't want to repeat, لكن هنا for example كاتب لك هنا unconditioned or unconditioned stimulus is you have a drug, okay, and response, unconditioned response, nausea. Okay, so whenever you take the drug you will feel nauseous, في غثيان. Okay, when you take the drug you feel nauseous. Okay, طيب, waiting in the room area. When you associate waiting in the room area and taking the drugs, that with time it will induce ايش؟ nausea. هنا ف waiting room هنا يسموه ايش؟ conditioned stimulus with a drug which is unconditioned stimulus. الريسبونس هنا unconditioned response. With time, طبعا هنا CS في البداية waiting room at the beginning it was a neutral stimulus. معناها ايش؟ when you wait in the waiting area في المكان مثلا اللي هو receiving الكيموثيرابي اللي هو drugs, يعني يعني انت when you wait for the drug, okay, in the waiting area, waiting ما راح يسبب لك nausea, الدرug هو اللي يسبب لك nausea. فالدرug at the beginning is unclassical stimulus, والresponse to nausea unclassical response. Waiting in the waiting area is what في البداية it's a neutral stimulus. It's not gonna produce any nausea. طيب لكن مع الوقت كل ما تنتظر waiting for the drug تنتظر في الويتنج اريا عشان تاخذ الدراج. فايش مع الوقت كل ما تاخذ الدراج تنتظر في الويتنج اريا تاخذ الدراج. مع الوقت وجودك just placing in the waiting area لسه انت ما اخذت الدراج الان. by sitting in the waiting area بشكل غير مباشر start to feel nauseous. فايش صار هنا؟ وجودك في الويتنج اريا صار conditioned stimulus والresponse النوزيا صار conditioned response. Okay. طيب some principle of classical conditionings we'll go through it. Something we call extinction, spontaneous recovery. Okay, what is extinction? When classical or conditioned stimulus is presented alone for a lengthy period of time without the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response disappears. How? Remember the example of the dog. When conditioned stimulus يعني تخيل معاي لما دائما تضرب الجرس. اوكي هو الان تعلم لما تضرب الجرس ايش الريسبونس حقه؟ he will salivate لانه تعلم الان ان there is food. لكن تخيل معي تضرب الجرس يجي ما يلقى فود، تضرب ثاني مره يجي ما يلقى فود. خلاص يبدا مع الوقت يتعلم انه ايش لما يضرب الجرس خلاص it will not produce any response من الدوغ. you're not gonna start salivate. فهذا نسميه extinction. ينخمد خلاص يختفي disappearance. Okay, this is what extinction means. Spontaneous recovery when re-emergence of a response that had been previously conditioned. بمعنى spontaneous recovery معناها ايش؟ خلاص الان ايش صار extinction في البداية لما تضرب الجرس خلاص هو تعلم الان انه خلاص ما في اكل، خلاص ما راح تقص عليه انت الان. طيب خلاص وقفت عن ضرب الجرس لفترة، بعد فترة طويلة يعني خلينا نقول for weeks. Then you start to ring the bell. once you ring the bell a dog start what to salivate. لأن ايش يبدأ يتذكر اكيد في اكل. فهذا نسميه ايش؟ spontaneous recovery. It start to re-emergence of the response. We'll have to يعني الريسبونس حيرجع، لكن انت اذا بديت يرجع لشكل مؤقت. بمعنى اذا استمريت انه ما في اكل خلاص حيختفي. اوكي فلازم انه you start to associate with food. اوكي واضح يا شباب هنا؟ طيب نجي الآن other principle of classical conditioning. We talked about extinction, we talked about spontaneous recovery. في حاجة احنا نسميها هنا stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization. The same example of the bell with the dog. هنا كيف stimulus generalization؟ ان الدوغ يبدا يتعلم ان whenever he hear a bell سواء any sound اي نوع من الجرس يبدا ايش induce a response. هنا تقدر تسميه انت عملت generalization. عملت ايش؟ ان من ايش معنى generalization؟ انك ايش خليت الدوغ whenever he hear a bell اي نوع اي صوت he will start to salivate with any kind of buzzer. هنا different bells. Okay, what we call this you generalize تعميم الstimulus. Okay, the opposite is the stimulus discrimination. لا ان الدوغ يتعلم ان the only way to respond is by a certain type of bell. نوع معين من الجرس. the same frequency. لو غيرته it will not produce any response. What we call this stimulus discrimination. Okay. طيب. The other example, this is example of stimulus generalization. Okay. يعني زي الاكزامبل اللي قلتكم حق الدوج. يعني this is just another example. هنا I'm not gonna repeat it. Okay شباب. طيب. Okay. Beyond classical conditioning, avoidance escape learning. Animals or humans will eventually learn to use classical stimulus as a signal to avoid unpleasant, unconditioned stimulus. For example, هنا أعطيك الإكزامبل هنا. إيش قاعد يقول هنا؟ If a cat is shocked after a light, it will learn to use the light as a signal to produce escape or avoidance response. والآن تعلم أنه لما يشوف الضوء he will be shocked. يعني أنت كات أنت حطيته في قفص تضرب يعني أول شيء تطلع نور lights. Whenever he sees the light he will be shocked. مع الوقت إيش تعلم إنه خلاص إنه whenever there is a light what will happen. هو عارف إن اللايت معناه he will be shocked. إيش بيسوي هو الفار الكات he will escape. Okay. He will run away. Okay. طيب هذا اللي احنا نسميه avoiding you learn to escape. Okay. Again, learned helplessness. First I'm gonna read the slides. Seligman and Mayer demonstrate that animals can be taught to be helpless and endure physically painful stimuli if they are taught they cannot escape. Okay? And they give, this is an example. They had 3 different groups of dogs, of which we are interested in 2, and a cage with 2 compartments separated by a low bar. One compartment was connected to a wire which would deliver an electric shock. The upper compartment was neutral. Okay. طيب هنا هذا السلايد تشوفه هنا. Okay. What happened? The first group of dogs were delivered a shock after a warning light was turned on, and they could escape by crossing to other compartments. They learned very quickly to do that when the light came on. Okay. فخلاص الآن في البداية هو تعلم الآن لما يشوف اللايت يجي له شوك. فايش يعمل لما يشوف اللايت بعدين ايش يسوي؟ ايش يبدا يهرب. He ran away to other compartment. طيب the second group هنا لا. The second group was in the same arrangement, but this time the dog were harnessed so they could not escape the shock. ما يقدر يغير الكومبارتمنتس. فهو في البداية شاف اللايتس, he received a shock, electrical shock, but he cannot run away. With time he learned he cannot escape. خلاص what's the point? I cannot. Okay. فهذا يتعلم يسمونه he learned helplessness. Okay. That after a number of trials, the second group of dogs, although now untied, did not escape. يعني حتى الآن بعد مع الوقت he learned that there is no way to escape. حتى لو شالوا ايش التايد الحبال اللي ربطوهم فيه, لو شالهم مع الآن خلاص تعلم انه ما يقدر يهرب. فخلاص حتى انه ايش خلاص ما هو مربوط, خلاص تعلم. زي الطير اللي تحطه في القفص, مع الوقت يتعلم. هو في البداية يبي ايش يهرب, مع الوقت تعلم انه ما في مجال, حتى لو تفتح القفص ما يهرب. خلاص he learned the helplessness. Okay. طيب اوكي شباب, this is another example. Okay. ف just read it يعني شباب. Okay, this is the end of the today's lecture. Next time we'll talk about in detail operant conditioning and learning by observation.